I had taken a collar off a man's neck once, back when I wore a uniform, and I remembered thinking at the time, it was the kind of thing you only got to do once in a life. I was wrong about that. The ledger taught me different. The ledger ran the lowland settlements like a quartermaster runs a warehouse. Everything counted, everything owed. You wore the hush, their feeding device fixed behind the ear, and in exchange for the warmth that dripped into your skull, you signed away the right to ask who decided what you owed, and to whom. I had worn a lot of things in my life. I never wore that. They called men like me refusal class. It went on a list somewhere, filed next to the deserters and the unregistered, and the handful of old women who'd stopped answering their door chimes, and eventually the list got expensive enough that somebody decided to collect. I had outlasted 2 notices already, by being too far out in the reaches to be worth the fuel. I should have known a 3rd would cost more than fuel. I was mending a snare line behind my cabin in the gray-wash reaches, the marsh fog still sitting low on the reeds the way it does most mornings out there, thick enough to taste, when the alert went out on every transmitter in 3 valleys at once. Quarry reassignment order, Bran Kessler, refusal class, debt outstanding. Collection unit deployed. The ledger's voice always had that same flat, clerkish calm, like it was reading off a grocery tally instead of a man's name. I finished the snare. There wasn't any sense rushing a knot. The unit they sent was called Unit 7 on the manifest, a salt-hide tracker, bred in the ledger's brine pits along the coast, built low and broad with plates like dark river stone, fused over corded muscle, eyes the flat yellow of low sun through smoke. They were built to find a scent and not lose it, through marsh or storm or 3 days of running water. I had heard what was left of men who tried to outrun one. I didn't try to outrun it. There wasn't any sense in that either. A man my age doesn't outrun anything bred for tracking, so I did the only sensible thing left to a man my age. I kept doing my chores, and let it close the distance on its own schedule instead of mine. It took 2 days. I heard it coming before I saw it. A low displacement in the marsh sound, the frogs going quiet in a widening circle, herons lifting off in clusters, a quarter-mile ahead of wherever it actually was. By the 2nd evening, even the wind seemed to be holding still for it. I walked my usual loop-checking trap lines, because a man who changes his habits the day he's hunted is a man telling the hunter exactly how frightened he's become, and I had decided by midday that I wasn't going to hand it that. It found me at dusk on the 2nd day, in a stand of black reeds where the mud sucked at my boots with every step, and I will tell you honestly that I had made peace with several different endings to that chase. I had not made peace with the one I got. It came out of the fog low and silent, the way water moves before it decides to flood, and it had me boxed against a deadfall before I'd finished turning around. Close enough to see the regime's collar band fused into the plating at its throat, blinking a slow amber pulse, a leash with no hand on it, just a signal marking where its duty ended. It opened its jaws. I had seen what those jaws did to a hide stretched on a drying rack outside the breeding pits. I did not think mine would look any different. I did not run, because there was nowhere to run to, and because some old instinct from the uniform years told me that a man who quits moving sometimes gets looked at instead of just killed. So I stood there in the mud with my hands open and empty, and I said the only thing that felt true. Go on then, or don't. Either way, I'm done walking today. It did not go on. I have turned that moment over more times than I can count, trying to name what changed in it, and the closest I have come is this. It had spent its whole short life hunting frightened men, men who ran and begged and flooded the air with the stink of it, and it had never once stood over someone who simply waited. Its great head tilted, slow, and the yellow eyes narrowed not in threat, but in something nearer to question. The jaws closed without taking anything. It lowered itself into the mud at my feet, the way a tired thing lowers itself when the work is finished, and let out a long breath through the vents along its jaw that I felt against my boots like a furnace door opening and shutting. I did not pet it. I am not a fool. But I sat down across from it in that mud, slow, close enough to feel the heat coming off its plating like a stove left burning, and after a while, I took out my belt knife and cut the dead leash band fused at its throat, the amber pulse going dark under the blade. The thing did not so much as flinch. Up close, I could see the long, pale scars under its jaw where some trainer's prod had worked it for years, and I found I did not have much sympathy left over for whoever had put them there. Verge, I told it, because that was where I'd found it, at the verge of the reeds, at the edge of whatever it had been before, and because a thing with a name stops being a number on a manifest, in my experience, and starts being something you have to account for. It looked at me the way nothing built to kill men for a living ought to look at anybody. Not cowed, not tame, just steady, the way you'd look at someone you'd decided to keep an eye on. Then it heaved itself up out of the mud and walked beside me back to the cabin, matching my pace without being told to, and slept across my threshold that night like it had been doing it for years instead of hours. For those 11 days, I had a salt-hide tracker underfoot in a one-room cabin, built for a single old man, and it turned out a thing that size takes up about as much floor as a kitchen table and eats about as much as I did in a week. It learned the difference between the chair I sat in and the one I didn't inside of a day, and my name, faster than it had ever learned its own number. I will not pretend it was gentle by nature. I watched it take a marsh cat apart in under a second the one time something tried the hen house, but it was gentle with me, the way a thing only gets to be with one person in its whole life. And I had stopped expecting that kind of arrangement from anybody, man or beast, a long time before Verge walked out of those reeds. The ledger does not forgive a debt that defects. 11 days later, Commissioner Hale Drur came up the marsh road himself, with 2 transport sleds of enforcers, and a crowd of settlers herded out from the lowlands to watch. Because an example only works if somebody's there to see it. They brought me down to the tally house, the long stone checkpoint where the ledger settled its accounts in public, and they brought Verge in a transport cage they had needed 4 men and a trank lance to load. Drur stood on the steps in his clean gray coat and told the gathered crowd, in the voice of a man reading from a script he'd used before, that a refusal-class debtor and a malfunctioning unit would both be reassigned today, as an example of what the ledger does with what it's owed. They opened the cage to finish it properly, in front of everyone, the way an example is supposed to be finished. Verge came out of that cage like something remembering exactly what it was built for, and what it was built for had stopped, 11 days ago, being anything the ledger pointed it at. It went through the enforcer line in seconds, not killing, because I had not asked it to, but tearing the trank lances out of their hands and the sled controls off their belts, leaving 4 grown men sitting in the dirt, with nothing in their fists, and no story left to tell about it. Then it turned, slow, and put itself between me and the steps, looking up at Commissioner Hale Drur with the same flat patience it had once aimed at me in the reeds. Drur's clean coat did not look so clean standing alone on those steps with his whole collection detail disarmed in the mud and a crowd of settlers, refusal class and hush wearing alike, watching him discover that the ledger's authority had never been anything but a leash with no hand on it, same as the one I'd cut. He opened his mouth twice, and nothing official came out either time. Then he turned and got back into his sled, and his troops followed him on foot, because nobody had offered to drive. I walked Verge home up the marsh road myself, past settlers who didn't speak, but didn't look away either, and I will tell you the debt got collected that day. Just not in the direction anybody at the tally house had written it down.